Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. This is Alexis here, but I'm in the two-seater Wayback Machine because I've got a co-host with me. It's Dawn.
And technically, I think we're not allowed to use Wayback Machine. I think Josh and Chuck at Stuff You Should Know might have that. If they don't have it trademarked, they have it taken care of by using it so frequently. So I think that's part of the reason we both use that analogy is we're accustomed to them using that. So we're in the not to impinge upon a copyright infringement or a trademark infringement because Stuff You Should Know is now part of a very big thing called iHeart and everything else. Yeah, I don't think A Fork in Time's lawyers can take on the Stuff You Should Know.
The travel back machine.
Okay, the travel back machine. We may actually try to trademark that, but it's the what if machine here on A Fork in Time. And as Alexis said, it's both of us here today. So we're having the opportunity to record again face-to-face, which we like to do. And so, Alexis, you want to give a little introduction into the topic? And I think we talked about off podcast, I have a little story to tell.
As I was saying, once you started telling the story, I remember the story. So we're going to be talking about something pretty timely, again, as we like to do here on the podcast.
Timely.
I know.
Clever.
Right?
Clever.
Right? But we're going to be talking about daylight saving time. Notice I said saving. We'll get into that.
So there's only one S?
There's only one S.
Aha. See, I've learned something already today. I think I knew that, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. So we're going to be talking about, why don't we just call it DST?
That's what everything I read doing research called it, so sure, let's go with that.
But that doesn't work well because that really is only applying in the United States and Canada. And as we were talking about off podcast, talking about the preparation we had done, this is not the only place that this phenomena occurs globally, correct?
No, there's a few countries. It's about 70.
Okay, and they are mostly, I think you would mostly describe them as in the northern hemisphere, and they would normally be what we would call Western nations in terms of this is Europe and the northern parts of North America that do this strange thing that is called DST, saving, not savings. There shouldn't be anybody that's listening to our podcast that is not familiar with this, but we do have a global audience.
Yes.
So it may be possible that there's somebody going, what in the world are they talking about? So in principle or in theory, or simply speaking, what is DST, or as I think they want to call it in Europe, they want to call it summertime.
Yeah, so simply speaking, in spring, usually it's March, we call it spring forward. So we will lose an hour on our clocks, and then actually coming up here in a couple days in the fall this year, it is on November 1st, we will fall backwards, which means we will gain an hour on our clocks. In layman's terms, simply speaking, that is what happens with DST.
Okay, so we at these arbitrary dates, we adjust the clock ahead 1 hour, and then later in the year we adjust the clock back 1 hour, so it's balanced over the whole course of the year, at least in theory. And why in the world would we even do that?
Well, a lot of people think it has to do with agriculture. That is not the case at all. It actually was implemented in the First World War in 1918, actually by Germany, as a way to make things more efficient with fighting battles and things like that.
Because battles, of course, follow nice time.
Yeah, they fall between the hours of 8:30 and 5 every single day.
Well, of course. So I mentioned that I was going to tell a story. Growing up, my father, my late father, who I respect a tremendous amount, anytime we would get around this particular time of whether we were springing forward or we were falling back, this was more in the day. He certainly wore a watch, but more in the day when things didn't automatically make this adjustment for you. That's one of the things we sort of take for granted now. I know, Alexis's generation, a lot of them in your generation people don't even wear a watch. What do they use to tell time? They use their...
My phone, it's sitting on the floor.
Yeah, they use their smart device. And of course, unless you set it otherwise, a smart device, a smartphone will automatically update to the local time when this change happens.
I'll get in my car and be like, oh yeah, I actually have to do that manually.
Yeah. And so it's the only clocks you have to change today generally are those that are not connected to some electronic source. And a lot of them, even the ones that aren't like a computer or a smartphone, still are smart enough to know when to make the change if they know the date. And so this has not always been the case. And so one of the exercises, particularly at the house that I grew up in, there were a lot of analog clocks or even digital clocks that required that they be manually reset. And so it was not uncommon as I was growing up, multiple days ahead of the particular day that we were either springing forward or that we were falling back, for the process to begin in the Shelley household of the changing of the clocks. And part of the reason for that is officially what time does this event actually happen?
2 a.m.
2 a.m. And so the concept there is it has to be such that when you make the adjustment, you don't change the date.
Right.
So that's the reason it's not done at
Midnight.
or 1 a.m. Particularly, for example, when you're in the fall, the autumn, the ending seasons of the year, fall back mode period.
Yes.
So it's at 2 a.m. And so suddenly what will happen is, in fact, this is what will happen on November 1st, is that at 2 a.m. on November 1st, it will suddenly then, the next minute will advance, and it will be 1:01 a.m. still on November 1st. What will have changed, though, is that we are in the central time zone of the United States. It will go from being called 2 a.m. CDT to 1:01 a.m. CST for standard time. And so that's when that happens. So that's just again, a reminder we all know how this works. You go to sleep and it's one time and you wake up, it's another time. Hence the annual changing of the clocks regimen at the Shelley household. I don't know of anyone, there may be someone out there who actually gets up, sets their alarm. Even setting your alarm for this is sort of a little bit funny if you think about it, because you set it at the old time to change it to the new time. But nobody actually changes their clocks that they manually have to change in the middle of the night. It's important for law enforcement personnel. It's important for transportation where they're scheduled. Things where the clock matters, it matters for. But most of us either adjust our clocks before we go to bed that night, or we adjust our clocks first thing the following morning. My dad, of course, didn't get up in the middle of the night, so he would begin adjusting the clocks, but he didn't always do it the Saturday night, because normally this is done on a Sunday morning, at least in the United States. And so it would not be uncommon for him when he saw a clock to realize that, oh, that's going to change. And so on Thursday, he may advance that clock or move that clock back. And so I remember very distinctly as a child going through this period before I probably fully grasped what DST was, where you would look at a clock within a certain number of days and you weren't quite sure, if you didn't already know,
what time it actually was.
Yeah, which time zone's not even the right word, which time phase, I guess, is the right word that it was set on. And so you'd have these conversations that would go something like, look at you, is that new time, old time? And there was normally a simple response. And the very fact that you had to have that conversation to me as a kid meant that this was probably far more confusing than it
needed
to be. So as we go down this alternate history path today, this is one of those things where we try to get away from, life and death kind of history. Although there's some life and death, maybe potential elements to DST. We're going to explore an alternate world where not that it's just some do and some don't, but that there is no such thing as this modification to time zones. No DST, no summertime, whatever you want to call it, that simply does not exist. I guess we are now approaching in the 8 minutes that we've gone to set up this episode, Alexis. Do you think we've adequately explained what could have taken only 30 seconds?
I think so, although I do have to say, I have actually been up around the 2 o'clock time. It's a weird thing to watch your phone do the automatic change. I would suggest everybody do it at least once, just because it's weird. It's kind of trippy to go from 2:01 to 1 o'clock. But yes, I think you explained it pretty well.
Okay. Well, the other thing I want to mention, this is the last thing, so this doesn't become this is all in the anecdotal introductory part of this week's episode, is the fact that I'm going to mention one of my pet peeves, because, when you have a podcast, one of the things you ought to be able to do is air publicly your pet peeves to your hundreds and hundreds of global listeners. But I do work in an area where, in fact, my job, we very often we don't express things in AM or PM because we use a 24-hour format for the reasons that we do. But I do work in multiple time zones. And so it's not uncommon, for example, I think most people who've listened to podcasting for time know that I work in something that is weather related. A lot of things in weather related are tied around what's known as UTC, Universal Coordinated Time, or what it's often referred to as is Zulu time. And so, for example, when we look at model runs from weather models, they will be like the 12Z run of a particular model, which means it's the 12 Zulu model. And universal Coordinated Time is the same thing as another abbreviation. Man, time is just full of abbreviations. As GMT, or Greenwich Mean Time, before it became UTC. And so, depending upon the time of the year, and again, this is where it's relevant to this particular thing, is that we actually deviate how far off of that we can be among multiple offices around the globe, not all using this time change at the same time, but coordinating against whether we are plus or minus so many hours to UTC. Most of us familiar with using our modern computers know that that's, a time zone is often expressed in parentheses, whether it's a plus or a minus to that. But that's not even my pet peeve. My pet peeve are people that during the period of time right now in the United States, if I ask them what time it is, will give me a time, and in the central time zone they will say, that is so-and-so, so-and-so, Central Standard Time. And the answer is no. Right now, we are in Central Daylight Time. And so the appropriate way to abbreviate that right now is CDT. But I have worked with and know this, not my current employer, not my current job, because they're much more precise. They're scientists. But I have worked with a number of people over the years who didn't understand the concept of the standard when they talked about certain standard time, was that it was referring to whether you were in the normal time mode or whether you were in the daylight saving time mode. Hence, again, in the United States where we are CST versus CDT. And I have gone round and around more than once with friends and coworkers who think that's just the way you describe the standardized time, regardless of whether you are in the daylight saving time season or whether you're not. And the answer is no. When you abbreviate CST, you mean you are after the period in the fall and before the period in the spring, and you use CDT otherwise. So, again, more of the intro here, which I think really sets up what we're going to talk about during the episode, of the things that go on because somebody decided to play with time. And so we'll pick back up our historical what if there had been no DST, summertime, or time adjustment after this break from someone who helps make the podcast possible. Taking a break from today's episode, Don and Alexis here talking about something we're really excited about. We've added a sponsor to A Fork in Time. Yes, we've grown up as a podcast. And today we're going to be talking about that sponsor, and that sponsor is Audible. Audible provides audio programming. They provide audio books and other audio-themed programs, primarily probably known for their audio books, but that's not all that they do. And what's cool about Audible is you can listen on any device. For example, a smartphone, you can listen on your PC. And these are unabridged, complete works. They have over hundreds of thousands of titles on audible.com that you can download and listen to. And one of my favorite ways to read is to be lazy enough just to be read to. Also, when I'm driving, my commute to work, something that I can have in the background sometimes. I really do like audiobooks, and Audible, hands down, in my opinion, is the best provider and service for Audible content, audio content there on audible.com. I've been an Audible subscriber since 2006, so I go back quite a ways with them. Alexis, I know that you also use Audible and you like to listen to some things here. We're an alternate history podcast, but sometimes that means we actually read and listen to things that are real history.
Yeah, we have to do the what did so we can do the what if.
Yeah, you hear that all the time. So, for example, what are some recent books on Audible that you've listened to that are actually in the historical what did?
Well, surprise, surprise, they're British.
Who would have thunk that?
I know, right? One of the books I've listened to recently, which is really good, is The Six Wives of Henry VIII by Alison Weir. Alison Weir is a fantastic Tudor historian, so pretty much anything she's written is fantastic. So The Six Wives of Henry VIII was really good. And then I've also listened to The Greatest Knight, which is the story of William Marshall, who was a courtier way back in about 1,000 years ago in the English court, and he had a fantastic life. Lived through many different reigns of many different people, so he was kind of a prolific person. So both of those I would recommend. They are fantastic reads, fantastic listens with Audible. Audible.
Yeah, and here's the deal that we've done for you, which is that like most things, you probably want to try it before you buy it or test it out. So the offer is this: just go to audibletrial, trial.com/a fork in time. And the offer is this: you can do a 30-day free trial membership, and with that trial membership, you get one download, a credit for a single download. That's a full, unabridged audio book, for example, an audio program. Again, over 100,000 titles to choose from. You can listen. I think once you do it, you'll find that you're hooked, and you'll find that it's one of the best ways in the world to read is to be read to, even if you're not 5. It works really well. So we would encourage you to take advantage of this offer. Again, that's www.audibletrial.com/a fork in time. You get something for free, and it helps the podcast. We hope you check it out.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. It's Alexis, but I'm not alone.
Don's still here. Trying to think if I have any more DST related pet peeves.
See, I don't even try and delineate between CDT, CST, because I know I'm gonna get it wrong, and I know it's one of your pet peeves, so I just say what time it is. I just don't even try.
Good. I have done well. I have succeeded, at least in that respect, as a father. So we said we're going to look at the historical what if of what if there wasn't any, and we're going to just settle on DST. So we have something that, understanding that that's not the way that it's referred to in Europe, and we know we have listeners there. And for those of you in the rest of the world, you're like, okay, I'll skip this podcast because this has zero to do with me. Although it has everything to do with you because you're living in our what if world.
Yes.
And that I think that is where it's relevant, is that the majority of the world by land mass
does not bother with this.
And the majority of the world, I guess, looking at the map here, the majority of the world by population does not bother with this.
No.
This is a subset, this is a minority of the human population on Earth that has decided to do this. So,
well, there are people in our own country that don't even deal with this.
You make an excellent point. For example, if you've ever, this is like, okay. This is
another story.
Yeah, this is going to be the anecdote episode, and Alexis may or may not remember this. I remember traveling in a western United States state in the early 2000s. In fact, the year was 2001.
Yep.
And we were driving eastward because we had left the Las Vegas and then ultimately the Grand Canyon area, and we're coming back across the state. This is across the northern part of Arizona, beautiful country. However, Arizona does this very interesting thing. As a whole state, what does Arizona do?
Follows it.
It does not follow it.
Oh, it doesn't. Yes.
Arizona as a state does not follow it, which means that they've said, yeah, you got your time change scheme, but we're not having any of that. And so during the summer months, from where we are in the central time zone in the United States, normally Arizona would be a 1-hour shift earlier in time. So -1 from central time in the United States. Except during the summer, Arizona didn't move, but
we did.
We did. And so we become a 2-hour separation from Arizona, or Arizona becomes the equivalent of Pacific time during that particular frame in time with the 2-hour offset. That's true. Arizona as an entire state elects not to follow DST. However, there are large sections of Arizona that are various forms of federal lands or tribal lands from the history that we've had, and those areas do follow the DST scheme. And so literally I remember on that particular drive, driving down a fairly remote road, passing the signs which would remind you that you were entering and leaving areas that may be subject to that time change. And I began to wonder, if you live close to these things, ultimately you just have to sort of settle on, or at least it used to only be 6 months a year. It's actually longer than that now. Mm-hmm. We actually stay in the DST mode longer than we used to. We go to it earlier and we move back from it later than we used to. And so the fact that if you're close there, the thing you would often deal with if you're just normally near a standardized time zone dividing line, having to settle upon which time you really pay attention to. You may live in one time zone but work in another, so you leave your watch set to your work time or other way around, however you choose to do it. But this is something that they do regularly, but then they also have to do it in a special way during the course. They do it for part of the year and they don't do it for another part of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And I began to wonder, what would it really be like to live there? And also deciding if I were going to move and relocate, that's probably not where I'd relocate to for that very purpose.
I feel I could be over exaggerating because I was quite young on that trip, although I do remember this, but it felt like it changed like 5 different times in the span of a couple hours drive. So yeah, I Arizona's beautiful. Don't know if I could live there just for this very reason.
Yeah. In fact, at one point in my business life, I actually did a lot of work with a company that was based in the Phoenix area in Scottsdale, and there was the benefit of at certain times the change in time would be a benefit or a detriment. But during the months where they did not follow it, and we had the 2-hour offset, it was more of a detriment to me than it was a benefit. And but they talked about the fact that it was something of a benefit to them because then they were aligned with their clients further west in California, and they were on the same time zone. So time zones is actually a whole other fascinating thing. I don't know how it fits well in an alternate history podcast. But now we're going to talk alternates. This concludes the anecdotal part of today's thing. So what would be different if there was no DST? What are some of the things that in your research or in your thoughts you've come across, Lex?
I think one of the biggest things would be better sleep patterns. I haven't noticed this with myself as much, although I have friends and people in the family that have a terrible time adjusting to the... But if you have a dog or a cat, I notice it around meal times because they don't understand that we've gone forward or backwards. So, for instance, Madison. Let's talk about Madison, our dog and our resident mascot here on the podcast. I know that on November 1st, coming up here in a few days, she will be ready for dinner at what is essentially going to be 5 p.m.
Right. When she's accustomed normally to being fed at
6.
And will be standing near her, will be meandering in the direction of where she gets fed about that time.
And then looking at you like, I don't understand why you're not coming over here.
So one of the things that would be different is we would not be dealing with the disruption, as you're pointing out here, not just to our human sleep patterns, which is a whole other thing. We're talking more about that. But we would not be dealing with the disruption to natural.
Just natural patterns.
Right.
When you change back and forth and do this flipping, it messes with your circadian rhythms. You have to readjust every few months. And yes, we have expanded the time. We do it for longer now, but still, whenever you have that change, you have to readapt to whatever the new circumstances are. Not just humans, but animals and all types of things have to adapt to this.
Yeah. I actually even know that some of my company and others that actually deal with shift working. One of the things they have to figure out is, are you going to have somebody work a short shift or is somebody really going to work a 9-hour shift? In other words, once a year, if you start at a time that's before the change and finish a time that's after the change, you're either going to have, instead of an 8-hour shift, you're going to have a 7-hour shift, or you're going to have a 9-hour shift. And how do you deal with that just from how you pay that employee? If they're an hourly employee, for example, how do you deal with that? Those are small things, but those are things that add up, that is an additional inconvenience or just an additional, business overhead that somebody has to deal with in the process. So we talked a little bit about the changes to human sleep patterns. In theory, before we talk about how things will be different, I guess we should probably talk about what some of the benefits were for this being brought into play. So what are some of the most common arguments that are made for why it's a good thing? Because then we'll have to talk about, in a world, our what if, where it doesn't exist, why that's important or why that's not important.
So one of the biggest things that comes into play is if there's more sunlight, then you don't have as much need for artificial light.
Okay, so the concept here is what happens in the summertime is that we're past the point where we've sprung forward. So what would have been, which by the way, it gets in the northern hemisphere, which is where this whole phenomena really
happens,
resides. In the northern hemisphere, the summer months are the longer periods of time. Summer being demarcated, actually, the beginning of summer being demarcated by the by the solstice. But before that, you've had the equinox, and what you've been doing is you've been building up to longer and longer and longer days. So the longest day of the year is the first day of summer. So typical sunset time during that can be pushing towards 9 o'clock under our current clock scheme.
Mm-hmm.
But that's only because of what? That's only because we've done what?
We sprung forward.
We pushed the clock 1 hour forward. So really, when at least in the latitudes that, and of course, latitude impacts that. You get further north, it actually does more. We understand how that works. We've been in places where it doesn't get dark till
that's trippy too.
10 or 11 o'clock, whatever, which is different. Those of you that have traveled or live in more northern climes, the company I work for, a lot of our folks are in Scandinavia, so they deal with that on a more regular basis. So I understand that when I'm talking to them and seeing the light pattern outside the office, not just a function of the time zone shifting, but where they are latitude-wise. But so what we've done there is we've taken what would normally let's say would be sunset at 8 o'clock, and we've converted that to a 9 o'clock sunset. So what's supposed to be the value of that?
Value of that is you have more sunlight coming into the windows, so you don't have to turn the lights on in your house, because that light is coming in from the windows.
So the concept in theory, there's energy savings attached to that.
Yes.
There's also supposedly economic benefits attached to this, right?
That would be lower bills because you're not having to turn the lights on.
Or retailers will say that people are more willing to go out and be out
and be social
and be out after work hours because they're not going to and from their cars at the store under artificial light. It's daylight outside. They feel safer because it's daylight outside, whatever the case is. So there's this combined energy economic benefit argument that's been made historically for why we do DST.
Exactly. Oh, another anecdotal story. This is the anecdotal podcast. So an example in my life is my boyfriend and I. We met in July. We walked to the beach. It was 7:30, 7:45, pushing 8 o'clock. It was bright. It was totally light outside. It was great. Flash forward couple weeks ago, beginning of October, we're doing the same thing, same time, and we're literally having to use flashlights on our phones because it's so much darker outside and it's the same time. So it's trippy. It's weird, but that's where that those savings come into play is you're not having to turn those lights on, you're not having to deal with those things because you have that sunlight still coming in at the same time when you're dealing with the summer months.
Okay. But more and more research, as I read and as we prepared for the podcast, there seemed to indicate that, there might be some savings attached to this, but it's probably not what we thought before.
No. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is this was instituted in 1918. Things have progressed a little bit since 1918. We've gotten a little more technologically advanced. So, while we might not be turning on the overhead lights in our house, we'll be doing things like looking at our phones, looking at our iPads or our computers, looking at movies, looking at things like that. So, we haven't really saved money in terms of electricity because we're using more electronics, even though we're not necessarily using lights.
Right. So, the consumption of electricity early on was primarily going to be for visualization, for lighting.
Yeah.
Other things, obviously, other things eventually came along that were obviously electric in the household. But now, so many things are consistent with...
but are you really using your can opener at 9 p.m.?
Right. And
not really.
And your your electric refrigerator is running 24/7, regardless of whether it's what your refrigerator actually now, because of smart refrigerators, does know what time it is. But at least in theory, your refrigerator didn't know what time it was, and so there's no adjustments there. So one of the things that was supposed to be a benefit for this is at least arguably debunked. You there still might be an argument for it, but it's not there. So if, again, getting back to the what if, so we just don't talk about the what is. Getting back to the what if. So let's say we don't have that. What is different?
So the biggest thing is that you kind of have this, it's always the same time and you always have the sun always sets and, let's pick if we're in the summer months or we're in the other part of the year, but the sun will always set at around the same time. So it's just you kind of adjust to what that normal is, and you don't have to worry about changing it every few months to adapt to what's changing. So it's like, hey, the sun's gonna set at 7:30, and it's always gonna set at 7:30. It's not, well, these months it's gonna set it at 7. A few months from now, it's gonna set at 9:15. You know,
there would still be the spring, the swings because of the changes in season and the changes in day length, but we exaggerate them in the summer by, in fact, that's why the daylight saving time comes in. Is it takes daylight that would have been in the morning and pushes that daylight to the evening, where it's considered to be more valuable for all kinds of reasons. Like, we want the extra hour of daylight to be put into a period of time when more people are awake and not asleep than when they are asleep. So it's transferring. We can easily just call it daylight transference time, because we're moving an hour from the morning, an hour to the afternoon. But there's another impact of that. You were talking about one of the other things that would be different, because there are folks that it does matter when the sun rises and sun sets, and that has nothing to do with electric consumption or anything else. So what would be different if we did not have DST, because of just that phenomena of how sunrise and sunset would be different at various times?
So we do have these groups in several countries around the world, America included, that are either Jews or Muslims, people who actually have to pray at delineated times of the day. One of those times is usually right before sunrise. So if you're doing this thing where you're pushing sunrise back or you're pulling sunrise forward based on what you're doing with the clock, and they have to be praying as the sun is coming up, if, say for example, later on this year, let's say December of 2020, if we are dealing with the time change, that pushes sunrise back to 8 o'clock or later. So if you're praying at sunrise, which is in the 8 o'clock hour, and you need to be at work by 9, say you work a normal 9 to 5 job, that's next to impossible. But if you don't do the daylight saving time, then you're praying in the 7 o'clock hour, can reasonably make it to work by 9 a.m. It's not a problem. So that's actually one of the cons of getting rid of DST, is we would probably have to have something in place in terms of workplace
protections.
Thank you.
And those types of things do exist, so we would accommodate that, but it's something that we don't have to encounter.
Yeah, it's something we don't think about now because we don't have to accommodate for it.
Okay, so that would be one thing that's also different. To me, the other more interesting thing, though, about a world where we didn't have this, so you wouldn't have the impacts that happen actually on the changeover days. One of the most interesting things to me, and there's a number of different studies, and I'll probably maybe link to a couple of them here in the show notes, is the realization of we make that time change, and particularly we're talking about the way it's often described and the way that people often think about it is in the spring, they steal an hour from me, and in the fall, they give me an hour back.
Yeah, they give it back.
For most of us, which one do we notice more?
I tend to notice fall more.
And why is that?
Because I'm getting the hour back.
Okay.
I don't think I'm normal.
No, I tend to notice the spring one more because they took my hour. Somebody give me my hour back. And for those of us that are not necessarily morning people, I want my hour.
I think that's why. I think that's because I'm a morning person.
And so there actually is this phenomenon, since it happens early on a Sunday morning, Sunday being the least worked day, and I mean, again, using the United States as an example here because of the concept of the weekend and the way that retail times and worship schedules and all kinds of other things that relate to Sunday. So, yeah, it's a little bit of an inconvenience to lose that hour on Sunday morning. Perhaps it makes it a little bit more difficult if you worship on Sundays to get up and get to church where you lost your hour, but that's probably not at the same time you were getting up and going to work. Or certainly you probably weren't having to get up and commute as far to get there, or whatever else you might be doing on a Sunday. We're in the American football season during that period of time for professional football. Those games don't kick off until middle of the day or later, so it's not like you're having an impact from that. However, you have the next day, which is the Monday. Mm-hmm. And there have been a number of studies which very clearly illustrate that vehicle commute on the Monday morning after the spring time adjustment, when time is sprung an hour forward. So you're 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 really interacting in a time that your body still believes is 1 hour
You should be in bed still.
earlier. There have been a number of things that have shown that there's an increase in the number of traffic accidents, traffic fatalities, all kinds of other things that happen on that sort of sleep hangover Monday that is a result of the change in time. You don't really have as much of the same phenomena in the fall because you have the benefit of it going in the
Other direction.
other direction. Although you might argue that suddenly there may be more incidents on that Sunday evening with people not realizing it's getting
Dark
as early as it was. So one of the other things is that they have found that there is a correlation in the amount of things like traffic accidents, even traffic congestion. Some of the other thing that's there. I was reading one study here which suggests that you could reduce traffic fatalities by 3 to 4%. That was in the United Kingdom, if you made these adjustments by not doing so, and that if you had a 1.2% reduction um, and the example that was given here was actually car pedestrian fatalities. If you would actually have a 5% reduction on the average versus an average Monday in pedestrian fatalities if you didn't make the time change. So in the big numbers scenario, that's not a big thing, unless someone you know or you happens to be
In a car accident?
that number, right? And then it matters a lot. So one of the things that would be different is we wouldn't be dealing with that particular day or series of days. Because the other thing that most of the studies seem to indicate is it takes multiple days.
I saw 5 to 7.
5 to 7 days for the body to sort of adjust to this new time regimen. So that's the most noticeable day, but I've seen statistical things that suggest that entire week has a little bit of a time sleep hangover phenomena that's happening, and so how that gets worked with. So what else?
I mean, it's not just driving. Yeah, I think I've read some things that that's literally the most dangerous day to drive is that Monday after the spring time change, because your body is still used to being in bed when it's having to commute to work. But also just workplace type things. It might be just you're sitting at your desk an hour earlier than your body thinks it should, and so your typing is maybe off, or you might be a little bit slower to do things. So it also messes with your just productivity overall, not just your ability to be able to operate a car, operate machinery, but just sitting, able to answer the phone, able to type, able to do things that you're normally able to do quite quickly. You're having to work a little bit extra hard because you're having to compensate for that hour.
But it's not just you that's compensated for that hour. There are systems around you that are compensating for that hour as well. So, for example, one of the other what-if differences is right now, computer programs, computer systems. I mentioned before about fire ambulance dispatch systems, the things that track when things happen in the middle of the night when most of us are asleep, but not everybody's asleep. It has to deal with these time change phenomena too.
Yes.
So what are some examples of how that has impact? That, again, talking about the impact, because in the world where there's a what if, we don't have that impact at all.
So we talked about the assumption that DST actually saves money. It actually costs money because you have to build those systems into those machines and into those tracking devices that they wouldn't have to exist otherwise. So it's almost like, I'm equating it in my head, and it's not quite the perfect analogy, but it's almost like Y2K on like a multi-time-a-year scenario, because we were freaked out with Y2K about, is the computer system going to freak out when we go from to 2000 from 1999? But we're kind of dealing with that on a micro level a couple times a year when it's having to deal with, it's 2 o'clock. Oh, wait, no, it's 1 o'clock, or vice versa. So it actually costs money to make sure those systems are up and in place. They don't go down. We don't have this mini meltdown every time we have to go through this change. Because those are life-saving systems when you're talking about fire, EMS, police. Those systems need to work 24/7, regardless of what time it is.
Right. And knowing what time it is for transportation schedules and for logistics coordination and all the things that go on where time is an important variable in the business equation means that when you play, even if you know when it's going to happen, when you adjust the time, you've adjusted the time. And again, that's assuming that we stay consistent about how and when we adjust the time. We have changed DST multiple times over the years in a couple of ways. We talked about areas of the country or areas of the world that choose not to do it, that are sometimes directly adjacent to an area that does. And so you have the phenomena we've already talked about in a number of anecdotes and stories there about how it changes how businesses inside and outside their organizations interact with each other during those periods of time. But you also, at various times, we've now changed when this actually happens on the calendar. It's been, I guess, just within the last, decade, 15 years?
I was going to say, I remember at least one of these changes.
Yeah, that we went from, I think initially we went to starting it earlier, and then the next thing we did was we ended it later. And so that now the majority of the year, from March to late October, early November, now functions in the non-standard time. That's why it has the D in the middle instead of the S. And so as a result of that, I even know devices that I had or have that had the old calendar mechanisms in them. So these are not things that are connected to the internet that would update themselves automatically or pull the time that way. But these are scenarios where the device knew when to change itself. It was a smart enough alarm clock, for example, to do that. So that it did the time change for you automatically, and that was great. Until it's doing the time change automatically under the old set of...
Yeah, on the wrong day.
Under the old set of rules at the wrong time. In fact, I think even at one point we owned an atomic clock, so it had the benefit of synchronizing clock from the signal that was sent, but it's just the time signal that was being sent, not the anyway, it changed time on the wrong day.
I remember that.
And so it's like, why is it doing... So you actually would... The benefit, one of the things you're supposed to do with this thing that was automatically going to update, you had to deactivate the automatic update because the automatic update was actually creating a problem and not a solution. And as I said before, growing up as a kid, I had at least a 3 to 4 day, maybe 5 day period of time when I was wandering around any house that we were in, wondering,
what time is it?
Did Dad set the clock forward or back yet or not? Or, as was often the case, and a friend of mine likes to remind me of this, it became my job once I became old enough to actually have to go around and set all the various clocks. I should mention that my mother liked to decorate with clocks. That was part of the wall decoration that she had a lot of places. And I never created the checklist because I was young and wouldn't have done this, but what Don would do today, probably if he had it, was create the checklist to remember all the places where there were
clocks.
And there were a lot of clocks. So certainly one of the things I can say would have been different is I would not be, almost sounds like I'm traumatized by this, I would not be traumatized by my clock-changing childhood as a result of not having this in place. Can you think of other big things that would be part of the What If, Lex? Or is this just one of those novelty things, or is it something that is bigger that we ought to explore a little bit deeper?
It's one of those novelty things, but also I think, and we've touched on, I think, the bigger, the deeper levels. When we're dealing with things like people's health, when we're dealing with things like people's productivity and people's jobs, those sound like kind of surface level things, but those are big issues that we're dealing with. I mean, again, some of the research I was doing is, the risk of heart attack, the risk of stroke. I mean, yeah, we talked about vehicle fatalities and things like that, but there's a lot that goes into those circadian rhythms and those things that really affect your health on an overall level. So while it's a kind of novelty thing to talk about, like, hey, getting rid of DST or keeping DST or whatever you want to do, I'm probably for getting rid of it, is what I would say. But yeah, it's one of those novelty things, but really thinking about how it does affect you and kind of finding ways to cope with it for sure.
Okay. So, in summary, as we sort of bring the episode to a close, this is one of those what ifs that we probably don't think about a lot as being a what if, because
we only think about it when we have to change the clock.
We only think about it twice a year, but it's something that affects us all of the rest of the time. So to me, it's one of those, I think it, as you sort of indicated well there in the way you summarized it, Lex, it's both a trivial thing and a non-trivial thing that we deal with here.
Right.
And so hope you've enjoyed that thought on what the historical what if would be as if there were no DST. And when you adjust your clock, assuming you're in a part of the world where you make that adjustment at or about the time you probably listen to this episode, because it'll be released in the time frame of when that will happen. Just remember that you're doing this because it's arbitrary and it didn't have to be this way.
No.
All right.
And it has nothing to do with agriculture.
Right. Exactly. All right. So again, we thank you for joining us today on this episode of A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. As we get ready to close out here, I want to say thank you to a number of our listeners who have been providing us feedback going to the website. So we're going to pimp the website one more time here, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Certainly welcome you to go there. It's a place to not only provide that feedback, you can find the entire back catalog of episodes. You can find some other interesting links there. There's an opportunity to put in suggestions for episode topics. We've met some of the actual folks that have joined us on the show as a result of their interaction with the website. So if you haven't been, we've talked about this so many times. We know that podcasting is a one-way audio medium, and we get that. But if you haven't had a chance to go and check out the website, it's not anything. It's not going to win any awards, but it is informational. It provides a good way to provide us feedback. Of course, you can find a number of ways to link and support us there. By sharing information on social media. So that's Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest. We need to get around to getting an Instagram set up. I know that's tied to Facebook and other things that are there, but we haven't done that as well. And of course, if you are so inclined and are in a position to do so, there's the opportunity to use the link there that would connect you to our Patreon situation, where you can contribute financially to the podcast and help offset some of the cost and keep things going. The realization, it really clicked to me. I think this is going to be episode number 77, if my memory is serving correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
We sort of moved past 75 and didn't even do a big wahoo about it. But it's hard for me to believe that we're actually now more than 3/4 of the way through our first 100 episodes. So if you've been with us from the start, we appreciate that. If you're a latecomer, we appreciate that. But the website can be an excellent place to go and get some updates there. Anything else you want to share or say, Lex, as we're closing out?
I don't think so. I think you've covered it.
All right.
And you've got social media. Good job.
I got social media. I would be remiss if I didn't do that. So as we close out this episode, we're going to do so as we are required to do, I think, by law. And actually, I have one more. Why not? It's the anecdote episode, right? And we'll know that if he listened to the bitter end, this will also be a test to see if he listened to the bitter end. But we sort of adapted our closeout of the show thing from a good friend of mine whose first name is Kenny, who's also a big baseball fan like me, the whole Yogi Berra and how it works in time. But if he's listening to this episode, probably has already thought about this anecdote, but he will also remember when it came to my father, when it came to daylight savings time, is that this was after I was an adult and had moved out of the house. Again, the phenomena of changing the time happened early on a Sunday morning. So the first time that I would see my father after the time change would normally be at church the following day, even though I was no longer living at home. And by this point, he had digital watches versus analog watches, and had before I'd moved out as well. But he often needed help adjusting the time on his digital watch. And so one of the other things I think that would drive my father crazy, this ties back to the fact that he'd already changed every other clock that he could change.
He had one that he couldn't?
One that he couldn't change and happened to be on his wrist. And so Kenny tells the story multiple times of remembering on Sunday mornings after the time change, my dad flagging me down, yes, to say hello to me because I'm his son and he loved me, but flagging me down because he needed me to change the time on his watch. And
I have a visual of Papa doing that.
Yeah, so that popped into my head as we're drawing here towards using the Yogi Berra closes. I'm guessing Kenny remembers that story. So Kenny, that was thrown in just for you, but the rest of the world gets to listen to it. So as we close out here, Alexis, what do we say adapting that Yogi Berra phrase when it comes to forks in time?
If you find a fork in time, take it.
All right. Have a great day, guys. Hope you join us next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.